In September of 1852, on a plantation along Virginia's James River, a woman who had everything society promised, wealth, status, safety, walked into her garden at midnight and never fully came back. Because in the shadows, she saw something she was never meant to witness. And from that moment on, the plantation stopped being a home and became a machine, one that could make people disappear. If you're into suspenseful investigative storytelling, the kind that takes a viral dark history legend and pulls it apart like a case file, subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. It helps me decide what region's stories to dig into next. Now let's begin the way every good nightmare begins, with a place everyone pretends is peaceful. Virginia's Tidewater in the 1850s was a world of polished manners and brutal reality. White-columned mansions, perfect dinners, church on Sundays, and behind it all, a system built on forced labor, silence, and fear. The story spreading across the internet calls it Whitmore Plantation. 12,000 acres of tobacco land, nearly 100 enslaved people, and an owner admired for his refinement. His name, Thomas Whitmore. Educated, well-spoken, gentlemanly. The kind of man who could quote Shakespeare at the table and talk about morality in the same breath as he talked about property. In 1846, Thomas married Margaret Preston Young. Beautiful, carefully trained for the role of a plantation mistress. She knew how to host, how to smile, how to make a house run like a clock. But 6 years into her marriage, Margaret felt nothing. Not the kind of sadness you can explain, not heartbreak, not grief, just a blankness that ate her alive. She did everything correctly, managed the household, entertained guests, handled social obligations, yet inside she felt like she was watching her own life from across a room. And the cruelest part, she couldn't even talk about it, because in that world, women weren't supposed to have needs. They were supposed to have duties. Then there was Samuel. In this legend, Samuel is described as Thomas Whitmore's most valuable slave and his most dangerous. A massive man, quiet, highly capable, the kind of person the other enslaved people avoided without being told to. And here's the detail that makes your skin crawl. People on the plantation didn't just fear Samuel's strength. They feared his certainty. Like he knew exactly what he could do and exactly what the world would let him get away with. By late summer of 1852, women had already been vanishing. Not every week, not every day. Just often enough to feel like a pattern, but spaced out enough that the plantation could absorb it. And every time the same explanation floated through the air like a spell, she ran away. No search parties that lasted longer than a day. No serious questions. No official panic. Because in that era, the disappearance of an enslaved woman didn't shake polite society the way it should have. Now, before we go further, I want you to understand the kind of place this legend is describing. A plantation isn't just land. It's logistics. It's schedules, shift changes, who's allowed to be where and at what time, who has keys, who carries lanterns, who sleeps closest to the doors, who gets blamed when something goes missing. And when you control a system like that, you can hide things inside it, because the machine keeps moving whether people inside it live or die. That's why this story feels so plausible to so many viewers. Not because we know the names are real, because we recognize the structure. Now here's where the story turns. On the night of September 17th, Margaret couldn't sleep. The house was still. Her husband was asleep. The staff had been dismissed. And Margaret, empty, restless, desperate to feel anything other than the suffocating sameness, slipped outside in her robe. The garden was silvered by moonlight, jasmine in the air. The kind of scene that should have felt romantic. Instead, it felt staged, like the world was holding its breath. Margaret walked the gravel path, trying to calm the storm in her chest. And then she heard it. Not a scream, not a shout, just a sound from the far edge of the garden that didn't belong there, an abrupt disturbance, muffled, swallowed quickly. Margaret froze. She should have turned back. She knew that. But curiosity is dangerous, and loneliness makes it worse. She moved closer. She parted the leaves. Samuel was there. And what froze Margaret wasn't only fear, it was the way he carried himself, calm, controlled, almost practiced. Not like a man caught in a moment, like a man finishing a routine. Before Margaret could even process what she was seeing, it was over. The movement stopped. The night went still again. Samuel adjusted himself, turned, and walked away without urgency, without panic, as if nothing had happened. Margaret stayed hidden, unable to breathe properly, staring into the space he left behind. And in that silence, one thought landed with terrifying clarity. On this plantation, people could vanish, and the world would keep moving. The next morning, breakfast was served like always. Tea poured, silverware clinked. Thomas Whitmore scanned his paper and spoke calmly about tobacco prices. Margaret sat across from him with a face trained to look serene. But inside her mind was screaming. Because she knew something had happened in the garden, something irreversible. And yet no alarm sounded. No one burst into the dining room, no frantic search began. It was like the plantation itself had swallowed the event and smoothed the surface back into place. That day, Margaret watched the house servants closely. A maid avoided eye contact. A footman's hands trembled when he carried a tray. In the kitchen, voices dropped the moment Margaret entered. The staff knew something, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say it out loud. And that's the first rule of this kind of story. The truth doesn't disappear. It just migrates into whispers. Days passed. Then quietly an announcement made the way you'd mention a broken tool or a missing horse. A young woman was officially listed as a runaway. Margaret's blood went cold because she knew what runaway could mean on a plantation that ran on denial. Now the story gets even darker, not because of what Samuel did, but because of what Margaret did next. In the viral versions, Margaret doesn't run to the sheriff. She doesn't confess to her husband. She doesn't become a hero. She becomes obsessed, not with Samuel as a person, but with that midnight moment because it cracked her numbness like ice. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something sharpen into focus inside her. And that terrified her. Because what kind of person feels awake after witnessing something monstrous? Margaret started walking at night again. Always with an excuse. Always careful. Always watching from a distance. And the legend says the disappearances continued. One from the laundry, one from the fields, one whose name would never be written down in a way history cared to preserve. Each time the plantation explained it the same way. Runaway. Discipline gone wrong. Bad luck. Margaret told herself she was searching for proof. Proof she could take to her husband. Proof she could take to the law. But the longer she watched, the more she realized something sickening. The system didn't want proof. The system wanted quiet, because proof would mean consequences. Proof would mean scandal. Proof would mean the respectable world would have to admit what kept it wealthy. And here's the part that makes this legend feel like a trap. Margaret begins to understand she's surrounded by incentives to stay silent. If she speaks, she becomes the woman who brings shame to the Whitmore name. If she speaks, she admits she was outside at midnight. If she speaks, she risks being blamed for inviting danger into the home. In that society, truth wasn't always power. Sometimes truth was a noose. Then comes the moment that shifts the story from fear to choice. In mid-November, when Thomas Whitmore traveled to Richmond on business, Margaret did something that should have ended the story immediately. She went to Samuel's cabin, past midnight. Cold air. A path that felt longer with every step. She stood at the door, hand raised, knowing that one knock would erase the possibility of pretending. She knocked. The door opened almost instantly, as if Samuel had been expecting her. No surprise, no confusion, just a quiet, watchful stare that made Margaret's skin prickle. Inside the cabin was simple, clean, controlled. Samuel said very little at first. And Margaret, fighting the urge to run, told him the truth. "I saw you." Samuel didn't deny it. In this story, that's what makes him terrifying. He doesn't plead. He doesn't bargain. He simply acknowledges the reality like it was an ordinary fact. And then he said something that reframed everything Margaret thought she understood. "Your husband knows what I am." Think about that. If that claim is true, it means Thomas Whitmore, this refined gentleman, kept a dangerous man not despite the risk, but because the fear served the plantation. Fear keeps people obedient. Fear keeps them quiet. Fear keeps them from running. And a plantation built on forced labor always needs fear. Now here's the twist that makes audiences lean toward the screen. Samuel doesn't threaten Margaret with violence. He threatens her with reality. He implies that the moment Margaret steps into his world, she won't be able to step back out and claim innocence. Not in her own mind, not in any investigation, not in history. It's not romance, it's leverage. And leverage is what runs this story. Because on paper, Samuel is property. But in the dark corners of this legend, Samuel holds something more valuable than strength information. If Samuel exposes Margaret, she's ruined. If Margaret exposes Samuel, the plantation's reputation collapses with him. And if the plantation collapses, Thomas collapses. Mutual destruction. A triangle of secrets. From there, the legend claims a pattern emerges. Disappearances continue carefully spaced, always just plausible enough, always easy to dismiss in a society that didn't value the missing. And Margaret, caught between dread and fixation, drifts deeper into Samuel's orbit. Not openly, not in daylight, but in glances, in timing, in silence. It becomes a language, a look across the yard, a delayed lantern at night, a door left unlatched in a house where doors are always latched. And here's the most unsettling idea in the viral versions: the plantation adapts. Like a living organism, like a body covering bruises with clothing. Workers stop asking questions because questions attract attention. Women stop walking alone after dark. Parents whisper warnings their children are too young to understand. And the house keeps running because survival demands routine. Now you might be thinking, wouldn't Thomas Whitmore notice? Here's the thing about a man who runs 12,000 acres. He notices patterns, not because he's kind, because he's responsible for profit, and profit depends on order. Margaret's changed demeanor, her strange absences, her sudden interest in parts of the property she used to ignore, and most importantly, too many disappearances to be coincidence. Then comes a chilling detail some versions emphasize. Thomas starts asking questions in the wrong places. A casual line at dinner. How many have we lost this year? A visit to the slave quarters he normally avoids. A conversation with the overseer that ends abruptly when Margaret enters. And suddenly Margaret realizes she might not be the only one watching. 3 days before the story claims Samuel was supposed to be sold away. Thomas confronts Margaret in their bedroom. He locks the door. He looks her in the eye. And he says, "I know." In the viral version, Thomas doesn't rage. He doesn't explode. He speaks like a man realizing his house is built on rot. He claims he knows about Margaret and Samuel, and he claims he knows about buried secrets, places on the land no one is supposed to walk. Margaret expects punishment, exposure, the end. But Thomas says something worse I can't report you, not without destroying myself. Because if law and society learn what was happening on Whitmore land, Thomas Whitmore becomes a scandal. A man who kept a monster as a tool. A man who either didn't see or chose not to see. So Thomas chooses the cleanest solution. He decides Samuel will be sold, moved far away, deep south, out of sight. And Margaret is trapped. She can't warn Samuel without admitting what she told Thomas. She can't stop the sale without risking exposure. For the first time in the story, Margaret experiences what the missing women experienced. The terror of having no good options. But here's what the legend wants you to feel. Samuel was never passive. Samuel watched Thomas. Samuel watched Margaret. Samuel watched the whole plantation like a chessboard. And when Samuel realizes he's being shipped away, he doesn't negotiate. He moves. The night before he's supposed to be transported, the story claims Samuel breaks into the main house, not through the front door, not like a servant, like someone who knows the house better than the people who own it. Margaret wakes to a presence in the room. Thomas wakes to see a shadow at the foot of his bed. And in that second, Thomas Whitmore realizes something he'd spent his entire life denying. You can't control what you've been using. In the legend, Samuel forces Thomas into a chair, binds him, and speaks calmly like a man delivering terms. Then he says, "Your wife and I are leaving tonight." Margaret's mind races. If Samuel leaves alone, the world hunts him. If Margaret stays, suspicion will eventually circle her like vultures. If she goes with him, she burns every bridge to her old identity. And here's the brutal heart of the story Margaret chooses. The next morning, Thomas Whitmore is found dead, and it looks like a robbery gone wrong. A window broken, a strongbox disturbed. The room staged with just enough chaos to tell a believable lie. The sheriff investigates. Neighbors gossip. Society mourns. And Margaret plays the role perfectly. Black dress, tears, soft voice, the portrait of grief. Because in a world that expects women to be delicate, grief becomes a shield. Weeks pass, and in the story, something happens that makes local society uneasy, but not uneasy enough to act. Samuel is seen with authority. Officially, he's employed. Unofficially, he's untouchable. He's present at meetings he shouldn't attend. He gives instructions the way an overseer would. He walks the land like it belongs to him. People whisper, they judge, but they don't push too hard, because money is insulation, and the plantation keeps producing. And society has always had a talent for looking away from what makes it uncomfortable. Now comes the part that turns this legend from a single event into a long nightmare: new arrivals, new purchases, new faces, new names that could vanish without paperwork noticing. The legend claims the disappearances don't stop. They simply continue quietly until the Civil War disrupts everything. And then the record goes blurry. Margaret lives into old age. Respectable, eccentric, untouchable. Samuel's fate is uncertain depending on the version you hear. Some say he stayed. Some say he disappeared into Reconstruction like smoke. But the fear remains. Because stories don't survive for 170 years unless they hook into something true. And here is the uncomfortable truth beneath this entire legend. Even if the Whitmore names and dates are exaggerated or stitched together for the algorithm, the world that produces a story like this was real. A world where the powerful could bury secrets on their own land. A world where missing enslaved women rarely triggered real investigation. A world where respectability often meant we don't ask. So now I'm going to ask you the question the algorithm hates because it slows the scroll. If a story is too perfect, too cinematic, too neatly paced to go viral, is it history? Or is it a warning about how easily history can be rewritten into entertainment? And here's the scarier follow-up. If a legend like this spreads because it feels plausible, what does that say about the reality people already know in their bones? If you want part 2, I'll do something most channels don't. I'll pick 3 viral dark history plantation legends and trace what's real, what's invented, and why certain details keep reappearing across platforms. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment. Part 2 if you want that episode next.